The way we take care of ourselves is ever evolving. And what we know for sure is that our mind and spirit are linked to our physical body, and that our wellness seems to extend into our communities and the planet we all share. It is very, very clear that wellness is interconnected. We love spending time with you to explore and practice the breakthroughs, the insights, and the passions of incredible people helping us all see the world in a whole new light. This is Health Gig.
Dora and I are very excited about today's guest who is joining us here on Health Gig. Her name is Sara Avant Stover, and she is the author of a new book called Handbook for the Heartbroken. This is a really, really incredible topic that she talks about, and a lot of it is about grief. We're excited to share this conversation with you.
Welcome to Health Gig, Sara. We want to begin by asking you a little bit about yourself and what led you to write your latest book. I think it's your third book, The Handbook for the Heartbroken.
I guess we'll go back towards the beginning. And we were talking before we started recording that I grew up on the East Coast in New York City and Connecticut. And I went to college in New York City. And as I was approaching my graduation, I was planning on going to serve in the Peace Corps in West Africa. And I was getting a litany of health tests needed in order to get a position there. And in one of those tests with my gynecologist, I found that I had the early stages of cervical cancer, which I now know is quite common for women who are in their late teens and early 20s. But it was quite progressed. And so with that diagnosis, I couldn't go to the Peace Corps because I was going to need regular screening every 3 months. And so I was really crushed. But is how life works, when one door closes, another door opens. And one of my teachers from high school was getting his master's at Columbia, and I was graduating from Barnard across the street. And we had coffee. And while we were having coffee together, he shared that he was going to go over to Thailand to be the headmaster of an American-style boarding school over there. And he offered me a job. And he offered me a job to teach English literature and writing and dance. And he said, the person who was just going to teach this just dropped out, and we need to know in the next couple of days if you want to come. So I didn't know anything about Thailand. Really, I just associated it with elephants and rice. And I remember I went to Barnes & Noble and read about it, and particularly about this city in the north where I would live called Chiang Mai. And I just felt, yes, I want to go there. So I ended up going there. I thought it was just going to be for a year, but I ended up living there for 9 years for the decade of my 20s. And it was there. Well, I taught at that school for a couple of years, and then I branched off to work for myself and started writing for US magazines, got my yoga certification, and then started specializing in supporting women. And that was really just the beginning of the journey that I continue to be on now. And I ended up moving back to the US when I was about 30 and moved here where I am now in Boulder, Colorado. And my first book came out at that time called The Way of the Happy Woman. Since then, I've been writing books and leading retreats and online programs for women, first starting with more of a general women's spirituality, but now I focus more exclusively on spiritual women entrepreneurs, but all about really finding our true power inside and expressing that on the outside and clearing all the obstacles, especially the limiting beliefs and the past wounds that stand in our way of doing that.
And your new book is The Handbook for the Heartbroken?
Yes. So the contrast, so my first book was called The Way of the Happy Woman, and then my third book is called A Handbook for the Heartbroken. But my books really follow the different seasons that we as women move through, both physically and emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And this book grew out of a series of experiences that I had, serial heartbreaks between 2016 and 2020. And the catalyzing event was finding out in a very shocking way that the man that I was engaged to, we were together for 5 years, that he had been cheating on me for the majority of our time together.
Oh, gosh.
Yes. And for anyone who's experienced a betrayal, you understand that it slices you through the core. It not only shattered our relationship, but it really shattered my sense of self, my trust in myself, my perception of what my life was about and what my life had been about for those past several years. And then it had ripple effects that moved out through all areas of my life, my relationships, my career, my finances. And that wasn't just a one and done event. Then there were several more experiences that happened over those years that led me deep into this studentship with heartbreak.
Can you tell us more about the others that happened and were they related to this, or how do you see that all transpired?
I don't know exactly how they were related to it. I think one of the things I talk about in the book is when we experience one heartbreak, that can have ripple effects and that can be lead domino. So say there's a divorce, or in my case, we weren't married, so it was a separation, but then that can have ripple effects. We can lose friends because our friends might be siding with one person or the other. We can have financial challenges if someone in the partnership was more of the breadwinner, especially in my case, being self-employed. It takes a lot to show up for people and to keep everything running. And when you're going through challenging times and you don't have time to rest and take a break, that can kind of have a compounding negative impact. There can be health challenges.
This was going on and you had no idea? And so I guess what were some of the aspects of your heartbreak journey that you struggled most with? Like, was it one day you found out, or did you suspect it, or how did that go?
There were times that I suspected it, and I had dreams at different times and actually had direct conversations with him and with the woman that I suspected might be happening with. They both vehemently denied it. There was no other evidence, and friends were challenging me that I was being paranoid and jealous, and I just needed to relax about it. So there was a lot of gaslighting going on, and that was also a big part of my healing process, is trying to wrap my mind around the level of lies and manipulation that I was exposed to and how I got myself into that situation in the first place.
When did you figure out that you were in fact correct? And did the people around you who were calling you paranoid and doubting you, were you able to connect with them on what really happened?
Well, I ended up finding out because one evening my former fiancé came home and he told me, because some people in his friend circle found out and confronted him, and he knew that I was going to find out. So he wanted to be the one to tell me. But the people who were saying that I was being paranoid and jealous, those were his close friends. And so there was just a sever in our social circles at the time. So I didn't end up having contact with them going forward. I'm not friends with them now.
Was it, I'm having an affair and I want to leave? Or was it like, I'm having this relationship and I just want you to know and it's over? Or how did that go?
He said that he had been having that relationship. And I found out shortly after that there were more people that he was with. I wasn't being told the full story, and bits and pieces started to come in the weeks and months and even years after that. So it was just clear that this is not a relationship for me to stay in.
Yeah. Wow. So with that, there's so many emotions that come up. I would imagine shame, definitely grief. What were your emotions and how do you deal with all that? Well, we're talking about it as separate. It's not separate in real time, right?
Yes. And I think that we've all had these moments in our lives where we have felt like the rug has been pulled out from underneath us. And maybe your story is different than mine. And if you haven't experienced that, you likely will. And it does bring a whole slew of emotions. And what I do in this book is really kind of each chapter goes in depth into different phases of the heartbreak journey and these different flavors that we experience. And so the first one that I felt was shock. And I say that that's nature's anesthesia, where we just can't take in the magnitude of what's happening because we know our whole life has just changed. What our life once was no longer exists, and we don't know what's next. We don't know who we are anymore. So I was in shock for some time where I didn't actually feel the pain of it. I was numb. I was numb to it. But it allowed that time, what it does is it allows us to kind of put some pieces in place, let people close to us know what's going on to get that extra cushioning or support, so that when the shock wears off and the pain sets in, we have more of a support network. And then there's grief and actually feeling the loss of whatever we're experiencing. And then, like you said, Patricia, there's shame. I felt shame. I felt humiliation.
Embarrassment.
I felt confusion.
Yeah.
Really knowing that I needed to have a deep reckoning with myself. And it's not like I wasn't a self-aware person. You know, I was a teacher and author of women's spirituality and healing, and I had done years of therapy, years of intensive spiritual practice. But still, I realized that there were aspects of me that I had not yet reached that could make me even be in that situation. So I had a lot of atoning to do within myself, a lot of healing to do.
How did it manifest for you? Was it depression? How did you do this?
Well, in the beginning, it's for all of us when we're going through a hard time, it's really one moment at a time and then one day at a time. And I just kept reminding myself of that and reminding myself just put one foot in front of the other. And my main focus at that time was just take care of my body, to make sure I was drinking water, that I was eating some food, that I was going for walks, doing some yoga practice. And even if I wasn't sleeping at times, because I had a lot of mental rumination in the middle of the night, just thinking back, like reviewing everything, reviewing what actually happened and what I thought was happening, at least letting my body rest. So really just going back to the basics and getting a lot of support.
Where did you get stuck, and where do other women get stuck?
There are a few different places. I think for me, the place where I got stuck, although in retrospect, I don't think I got stuck, I think it was just part of the process. These serial heartbreaks lasted for several years, and I got to the point where I just felt like, okay, maybe this is the end of it, and now things are going to turn around.
Right.
And I'm going to have a life again. I'm going to feel like myself again, because I was just in so much uncertainty for so many years. I think an area where I may have gotten potentially stuck is wanting it to end and wanting it to go faster than it was actually going. And that's also what we hear outside of us. It's like, hurry up, move on, get on with it. I had friends who were getting frustrated that I was still going through challenging times. I lost relationships. So that's one area. Another area can be the fear of feeling grief. Because grief is such a huge energy, it can be easy to avoid it by just staying busy, by numbing out in the various ways that we all do, and understandably, because grief is not easy to feel. It's very overpowering. So avoiding actually surrendering to grief, which is the engine of transformation. Without letting grief move through us, we're not going to be carried to the shores of our new life. And then the third place where I often see women getting stuck is in anger and resentment, which can come either through lashing out with anger or suppressing the anger. Rather, again, just letting yourself feel it, letting that fire kind of burn you and burn through the structures of your life that need to burn in order for some new life to come in.
You talk about how a single heartbreak does lead to cascading losses. And I guess because you're going through this, what we might call a transformation. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I know you touched on it and that you've lost relationships, but can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, this goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier with the example of a divorce, where we can get divorced and we can feel the grief, we can feel the shock, we can feel the anger, and we can also lose friends. And because we are under heightened stress, hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are coursing through us, we can start to have health challenges. Maybe our immune system can weaken. You can develop diabetes. You can develop, for women, a lot of autoimmune illnesses. You can have financial challenges. You might need to, shift how you relate with your children or divide up pets. You might need to leave your home. So it just has these huge ripple effects that don't just end with the actual event itself.
Talk about some of the mindsets and practices that you talk about in your book that can help women.
The first two that come to mind is going back to talking about what do we need to do to get unstuck? What is the difference between being stuck and getting unstuck and moving through the different phases of the process? I would say the dominant pathway that I used for that is this concept of the only way out is in and through. Or another way to say that is you have to feel it to heal it. So just reminding myself that whatever was coming up was okay. There was nothing wrong with it. There was nothing wrong with me, but whatever was coming up needed my attention and needed me to feel it and to be with it. And then a way to take that deeper, something else that supported me a lot throughout this time, and it's a healing modality that I weave throughout the book, is the psychotherapeutic model of internal family systems, also known as IFS.
Oh, right.
Which works with different parts of ourselves. And it says that we're not a singular self. We have a multiplicity. We've all had the experience of saying, like, a part of me feels angry and a part of me feels grateful, or, we can have conflicting experiences inside, and that's normal. And one of the premises of IFS is that all parts are welcome and all parts have a positive intention. And that really helped me through this process because I could see that even the parts that felt shame, or at certain times I had suicidal ideation, which I know is also common when we're going through challenging times, but to know that those parts of me that were feeling that way, they weren't bad. They just needed some extra care and attention. Or even the parts of me that led me to be in that relationship in the first place, those parts that had low self-worth, those parts that were afraid of abandonment and then so attracted the abandonment, that those parts also needed my care and attention. And that was going to be part of my process of healing and creating a new experience for myself on the other side of this.
Did you identify what part that was? Like, how did that go? So was this a very young self that was experiencing this? Were you able to get into that yourself? Or was it when you started doing the parts work, internal family systems work, that then you started asking those questions and then you were able to get to the different parts of you, right?
Yes. So I was grateful in that I had started work with IFS before all this happened. When this happened, I realized, I need to do this much more intensively
Okay.
and kind of just take this on as one of my main things in life right now. IFS works as kind of like unraveling a spool of yarn, and you unravel it, and it just starts to reveal more and more. Yes, I was able to go deeper into parts of me and explore hidden parts and hidden dimensions of parts that I had already known, parts that were young. Most of them were young. Little girls stuck in time with wounds from my childhood, which I was aware of, I'd done a lot of work with, but hadn't fully been resolved because in certain ways those parts were still driving the bus of my life.
Talk to us about how you got to that. I mean, like you said, you labeled it, you saw it, you knew which part it was or identified, but how do you get it to do it? Because so often we get stuck with that part, like we're doing our work, we're doing our thing. I've put a lot of time into it. I think I've done it, but I'm still not. Like, how did you get, I want to say, next level on it?
Well, it was really through the IFS model, and that's why I now am certified in it and integrated into all my work, because I really saw this works. This is what helps us to actually get to the root of these things that we haven't been able to resolve, that maybe if we've done a lot of therapy, it still hasn't healed. And the way that the model leads us in, these qualities of curiosity and compassion go such a long way. We go inside without the agenda to fix or change or get rid of any aspect of ourselves, but instead we embrace a process that IFS calls befriending, and really, really getting to know these parts of us, kind of getting eye to eye with them, hearing their secret histories and their stories. That allows us then to unfreeze them in time, because trauma is just frozen energy, unfreeze them in time and kind of give them the parenting and the mentorship that they didn't get so that they can grow up and end up being supportive parts of our system that are helping us move in the direction that we actually want to move in.
And what you said, I think, is so important, is the idea that they're coming up protecting you. Like they're coming up saying, I'm doing this. This is what we need to do. This has happened. This is what I know works. And I love you, right? Is the idea. And then you're able to go into them and say, it's okay now. I've got this, that kind of thing.
Yes, because a lot of times they still think that, in my case, that little girl, say that 5-year-old, she thought I was still 5. And she thought we were still back in my childhood home in Connecticut. And I just had to bring her into current time and say, no, actually, look, at that time I was in my late 30s and look at my life and look at all these things that I've done. In IFS, we call it updating.
Right. I love that. And the thing of it is in that what you just said is trauma is frozen energy. And this is such a neat way to get into that energy and help it thaw out.
So, talk about the fine line between thinking positively and spiritual bypassing. What's the difference? And is there a time on the heartbreak journey to try and be positive and move on?
That's a fine line that we need to navigate throughout the process. And I always err on the side on it takes as long as it takes. Keep meeting whatever arises. Because what happens when we go towards positive thinking too soon, or really at any time, I think the first step is always to be with what's here, to meet life on life's terms. If we're feeling sad, to let ourselves feel sad. If we're feeling grief, to let ourselves feel the grief. If we're feeling anger, let ourselves feel angry. I know it's easier said than done. It's definitely a skill set that we're not educated in cultivating. And that was one of my intentions of this book, is to give more resources to help grow our capacity to be with the hard feelings, to be with the hard moments head on, because that's actually what makes them feel better, right? We have to meet it directly first. And then I would say we know when there's a moment when we start to feel like ourselves again. And we start to feel like the ground is rising up beneath our feet again. Things are starting to stabilize. Life starts to communicate with us. We're moving out of this transition. I think when we start to see those signs, just like right now, we're seeing the signs of spring, it's just something that organically happens. Then we can start to feel, okay, are there ways that I'm staying stuck in any of these feelings? And that's also maybe where we want support from trusted friends or mentors or therapists to see, are there ways I'm being stuck? And if so, that's just a sign that we haven't fully listened to that or been with that enough. And maybe it's just needing more of our time so that it can fully move through.
Yes, it reminds me of The Guest House by Rumi, welcoming things in.
I love that poem.
And I was also thinking too that even while this is happening, you were talking about spring, when things start to come up, it might not be in the way you expect it to. We might have been under a rock and it might have to go left and right and not be the beautiful flower we think maybe we should be. And so it's also letting go of what this transformation in your mind you want it to be.
100%. Yes. I think that's one of the big lessons of heartbreak, is to really let go of how we think our life is going to look or should look. And I think we all, by age 40, definitely 50, we all look at our lives and we think, wow, this isn't what I envisioned my life to be. But at least for me, there's an appreciation for what my life actually is. There's a trust that this is what's meant for me. This is what's authentic for me. And there's definitely some falls from grace and some humility that happened in terms of letting go of certain dreams in order to actually step into the life that's meant for me.
Can we go back to understanding the thinking positively and the spiritual bypassing again? What I think you're saying is we quickly go to, today's going to be the best day of my life. I'm going to do it this way, but you might not be ready for that. And then the spiritual bypassing, what does that mean?
That's like what you just said. It's like when we feel something, but then we jump outside of it, we jump above it, and we try to think our way out of it with positive thinking or affirmations.
Okay.
And there's room for both. I'm a big fan of a both and approach. But again, the first step is to go in and feel, relax and allow whatever is here. Because when we do that, that's actually when grace can happen or when life can happen. And that automatically shows us the next step rather than us trying to will it and control it.
Thank you for that.
So, why is it important for women to ask for help during their heartbreak journeys? And what are the tips that make it easier?
Well, I think that I've worked with thousands of women, and I know this is probably true for every single woman I've worked with. I have a tendency to be very self-sufficient and to feel like I can do everything myself. I'm very capable. And we're also raised that way. We have a very hyper individualistic culture. And there can also be some frowning upon people being too needy, too vulnerable, too dependent, really needing to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. But when we go through a challenging time, we can't go through it by ourselves. We can't go through anything by ourselves. We need community, we need support. And I feel like that's one of the big things that we are in a process culturally of shifting and changing, of realizing how much we actually need each other, how much we need communities to rally around us, especially in hard times. I spent some time talking about that in the book, just giving women different examples. Like, these are some ways you can ask for help, because sometimes we don't ask for help because we don't even know what to ask for, or we don't even know who to ask. And so we just need some ideas.
You know, what just occurred to me too is that when this heartbreak happens or when this happens, life doesn't stop. And then at one point, you're beginning to think, I can't keep asking people for help. I mean, so how do you respond to someone that says, okay, well, this happened, and now all of a sudden that happened, and all of a sudden that happened, and then it's like, uh-oh, I'm a little too much for everybody. How would you? I might add for myself too. How do you talk about that?
It's hard. It's hard. And I want to say that my experience, hopefully there's not too many people who are experiencing so many hardships over such a long period of time. But I definitely reached places where I was very, very lonely. I would say the one person, aside from the therapist, non-paid professional, who was there for me through the whole thing was my mom. And I was very grateful for that. Just, we talked on the phone a lot, we texted a lot. And so I'd say if we can at least have one person. Also, my dog, Sadie, I got her in the summer. I adopted her the summer after my fiancé and I separated. And that was just such a source of companionship. So it doesn't even need to necessarily be human, but we need some empathic connection.
Yeah. Oh, I so agree with you about dogs. I think that's so true.
And nature was also a huge resource. I live in Colorado where there's incredible nature. So just going out for walks, and nature is the expression of wholeness. So even just a simple walk around the neighborhood or in a park or a hike or something has an impact and has some form of connection, even if we're not consciously making that connection.
On the side of those of us that are supporting somebody who's going through a heartbreak, how best can people do that? How did your mother do it? What happened? She talked to you every single day, or did she just know the questions to ask? How did that work?
With my mom, as my grandmother used to say, bless her heart, her intention was to always be there for me. I would say she didn't always necessarily say the things that I wanted her to say or needed her to say, but she was doing her best. The most important thing is just to be the presence of love with someone. Relationships between mothers and daughters are complicated. I know it was very hard for my mom to see me suffering so much for so many years. And I know there's a saying that a mother's only doing as well as her child who's doing the worst or something like that.
Yes.
But just being the presence of love, and even just holding that intention when we're sitting with someone or on the other end of the phone or FaceTime with someone who's going through a hard time, a friend or a loved one, is just saying, how can I just be the presence of love right now? And really just listening and validating, saying things like, that sounds really hard, or tell me more about how that is for you, and not going into any advice giving or fix it mode, because that just usually makes things worse.
Or saying, I know how you feel, because everybody's journey is their own and you can't possibly know how someone else feels.
That is a great point. And also not jumping in and sharing our own story of, oh, well, when this happened to me, just leaving a lot more space, a lot more room just for listening than perhaps we feel comfortable with.
Your book is so important because what it does is it brings up the point or the issue of the dysfunctional relationships we have with loss and grief. What can we do to change that? Why are we rushing through things?
Well, we're not educated in how to grieve or why it's even important. The second chapter of the book is called Bowing to Grief, and I share the story of a grief ritual that I went to here in Boulder. These grief rituals were brought over to the US from West Africa, from Mali Doma and Sobonfu Somé, who are from Burkina Faso. There in West Africa, there are whole elaborate community rituals around grief, really understanding that a single person does not even have the infrastructure in their nervous system to run the big energy that grief is, that we actually need to plug our energy into community in order to process the grief. And that there are a number of things that we'll always be grieving, and we need to do it regularly. And in the world right now, there's a whole host of things to be grieving. Even if we ourselves are not experiencing grief, there's collective grief that if we don't process it, it gets stuck in the collective, just like it gets stuck in the individual. And this is just not part of our culture. It's not part of our understanding. And so one of my intentions in writing this book was to help to bring more of that understanding of this is how you grieve, this is why it's important, and these are the benefits that you'll experience when you do. Because again, grief is the transformational engine. If we don't let it do its work within us, we're not going to experience the transformation.
Pema Chodron talks a lot about that. She talks a lot about the fact that we just don't honor this idea of transitions very well, that we see things as solid. So if we saw things as changing all the time, grief then becomes part of our life in the sense that we're always losing something, something else is always coming back, so that the big moments of a heartbreak or of a this or this, we're at a better place to accept it.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because one of the things that happens then is that we have these heartbreaks and points of grief throughout our life back to childhood that were not processed. And so that's another intention in this book. It's not just for people who are experiencing heartbreak right now, but it's really a chance to look back and see what are the times in my life that I didn't have the resources within me, or I didn't have the external support or the time or the space to do this externally, and that those things are holding us back in some form or another. Those things are, again, are frozen in time or stuck in our system or driving us in some unconscious way or maybe a conscious way. And so once we have the understanding and the tools, then we can go back and heal those. And like you said, Patricia, going forward, once we have really strengthened the muscle of being with uncertainty and being with suffering, we can work that muscle through the rest of our lives, through all the other heartbreaks that we're going to face and the people around us are going to face.
I saw you on YouTube reading from Pema Chodron, speaking of Pema Chodron's book, When Things Fall Apart. So is this book sort of a layperson's When Things Fall Apart?
I love that book, and that has been a companion during hard times. And yes, I guess you could say that it is. I don't think there are many resources, enough resources for when we're in the dark valley of our lives that can really be an intimate support and companion during those dark hours. And Pema Chodron's book, When Things Fall Apart, is, and my hope for this book is that it is that too.
Sara, well, how do people find your book? And do you have a website? And how do people find you?
The book is available wherever books are sold, but you can also find it at handbookfortheheartbroken.com. And I also have some extra gifts to accompany the book if you want to send in a receipt after you purchase the book. And from handbookfortheheartbroken.com, that also leads you into my website, which is just saraavantstover.com. And there you can find my podcast, which is called Herself. I'm on Instagram a lot at Sara Avant Stover, and you can see all my other programs and retreats for women there as well.
Gosh, thank
Perfect.
you. And thank you for the work you're doing. This is an incredible topic that so many people will benefit from this book. So thank you for this.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on Health Gig. We loved having you with us. We hope you'll tune in again next week. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast and follow us on healthgigpod.com. I'm Tricia.
And I'm Doro.
Be well.